The night Diana's death was announced, the world stood still. For millions, it was a shocking loss, but for two young boys, it was the day their world shattered forever. Imagine being just a child, still clinging to the innocence of youth, and waking up to discover that your mother, the one person who shielded you from the pressures of the monarchy, was gone in an instant. That was the reality for Prince William and Prince Harry, and it became the defining scar of their childhood. But what if the story they were told for decades wasn't the full truth? What if the man they trusted as their father had hidden something so devastating, so unspeakable, that it forced them to confront him 30 years later with one unshakable question? Why did you end our mother's life? From the beginning, the death of Princess Diana has been wrapped in tragedy, conspiracy, and unanswered questions. Newspapers shouted about paparazzi, the car crash in the Paris tunnel, and speculation over what went wrong. Yet through all the media noise, one fact remained constant. Two young boys were left motherless, and the royal family quickly closed ranks. William and Harry were told to grieve quietly, to show strength in public, to march behind their mother's coffin with stoic faces. But beneath that silence, questions began to fester. Questions about what really happened in Paris, why Diana felt unsafe in the months leading up to her death, and why certain truths were locked away behind palace walls. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The introduction to this story must confront the uncomfortable reality. For 30 years, William and Harry lived under an official narrative that may not align with the secrets King Charles guarded. And when those secrets began to unravel, they weren't simply about an accident or a tragic twist of fate. They touched the deepest wound in the royal family. The idea that Diana's death may not have been as unplanned as the world was told. The pain of this discovery forced William and Harry to face their father not as their monarch, but as the man who may have known far more about their mother's fate than he ever admitted. But before diving into the confrontation, we must return to that pivotal moment in 1997. William was just 15, Harry only 12. Both boys were at Balmoral when the news came. The adults around them, Charles, the Queen, courtiers, were focused on how to control the message, how to present the monarchy in the right light. Yet for William and Harry, the shock was personal, visceral, and life-altering. They cried behind closed doors, but in public, their emotions were tightly managed. From that day on, grief became something they carried in silence. It is important to remember that grief left unspoken doesn't fade. It hardens, it transforms into anger and obsession with truth. This is the root of what brings us here 30 years later. Two sons determined to understand whether their father, the man who once walked them behind their mother's coffin, had been protecting them or deceiving them. As the years passed, William and Harry often spoke of their mother with reverence. Harry described her as his guiding light, the one person who made him feel normal. William confessed she was his moral compass, always reminding him that the crown meant nothing without compassion. But both sons knew Diana feared for her life before Paris. She confided to close friends that she felt hunted, that powerful figures wanted her silenced. She even recorded a chilling tape, stating she believed she would one day die in a staged accident. This detail, widely reported yet often dismissed, now takes on haunting significance. If Diana herself predicted her demise, what does that say about the forces surrounding her? And more importantly, what does it suggest about what Charles may have known? The introduction to this story cannot shy away from the weight of betrayal. Imagine the emotional chaos of realizing that your father, the man you trusted to raise you after your mother's death, may have hidden critical truths. For William and Harry, this discovery wasn't just about history. It was about family, identity, and justice. They grew up believing one version of events, only to find evidence that their father might have been complicit in keeping them away from the truth. That is not just betrayal. It is the dismantling of the bond between parent and child. But the story becomes even more complex when you consider Charles's position. For 30 years, he lived under the shadow of Diana's death. His popularity plummeted in the wake of the tragedy. Many blamed him indirectly because of his affair with Camilla, the fractured marriage, and the emotional torment Diana endured. To protect the monarchy, Charles needed to maintain a careful narrative. Yet in doing so, Did he cross a line from damage control into deception? This is the question William and Harry would eventually demand answers to. And it is this confrontation that forms the beating heart of our story. As viewers, you're being drawn into more than a family drama. This is about power, legacy, and the dangerous balance between truth and survival. For 30 years, the monarchy's survival depended on silencing certain details. But survival comes at a cost. For William and Harry, that cost was innocence, their ability to fully trust the man who raised them. This story unfolds like a tragedy, not just for a family, but for an institution that thrives on secrecy. And it leaves us wondering, how much truth does the world really deserve to know, and how much is buried to protect the crown? The middle of this introduction must heighten the tension by focusing on the moment of revelation. It wasn't a single newspaper headline or an idle rumor that triggered William and Harry's confrontation. It was a series of discoveries that pointed back to their father. Perhaps it was access to files long locked away, conversations with people who had once stayed silent, or even confessions from those who could no longer keep their loyalty to the monarchy. Piece by piece, a picture formed that contradicted the neat story of an accident. And as the picture sharpened, one conclusion became unavoidable. Charles had known something, and he had kept it from them. Consider the emotional storm that must have raged within the brothers. William, always the duty-bound heir, suddenly confronted with evidence that his future as king was built on a lie. Harry, already estranged from the institution, now given fresh fuel for his disillusionment. Together, they decided to confront the man who had shaped their lives and ruled their futures. But how do you look your father in the eye and ask him if he was responsible for your mother's death? How do you carry that question without it breaking you? The end of this introduction leaves us on the cliffhanger that defines the story, the confrontation itself. After 30 years of silence, William and Harry finally stood before Charles, voices trembling, hearts breaking, and demanded the truth. The image of two grown men, still sons at heart, asking their father why he ended their mother's life is as haunting as it is unforgettable. It is not just about uncovering history. It is about healing wounds that never closed, about forcing accountability from the man who wears the crown. And so, this story begins with a tragedy, builds into suspicion, and leads us directly into the heart of a confrontation that could change the way history remembers not just Diana, but the monarchy itself. What Charles revealed, or failed to reveal, will shake not only his sons, but the very foundation of the institution he leads. And as you follow this story, you will be forced to ask yourself, if you were in William and Harry's place, would you have the strength to demand answers? Or would the truth be too unbearable to face? The silence that surrounded Diana's death was deafening, but for William and Harry, it was more than silence. It was a cage. Every question they had was met with half answers. Every moment of curiosity about what really happened was drowned in rehearsed lines and official statements. Growing up, they were constantly reminded of their duty to the crown, yet at the same time denied the one thing every child deserves, the truth about their mother. Imagine being told to smile at charity events, wave at cameras, and represent the future of the monarchy, all while knowing deep down that a piece of your story was missing. That tension doesn't just vanish, it builds. And for 30 years, it built into a storm that would one day break. The beginning of this storm can be traced to Diana herself. In the years before her death, she often expressed fears for her safety. Her friends, her butler, even journalists heard her say she believed she would be killed. There was that infamous note where she predicted she would die in a car accident, her brakes tampered with. At the time, people dismissed it as paranoia. But when William and Harry came across those words as adults, they saw them differently. For them, it wasn't paranoia, it was prophecy. And if their mother had known something was coming, then someone must have known too. That realization planted seeds of suspicion that could no longer be ignored. As they matured, the brothers also began to see how the world remembered their mother. Diana wasn't just a princess. She was a global icon, the people's princess, a woman who had transcended the confines of royalty to become a voice for compassion and humanity. The contrast between how the public adored her and how the palace often dismissed her left William and Harry uneasy. They started to question whether their mother had been a threat not to herself, but to the system she was part of. If she was silenced, then who benefited? And why was it that their father always seemed to dodge the hardest questions about her final years? It is here in the middle of the introduction that the emotional weight intensifies. William and Harry weren't just grappling with grief, they were grappling with betrayal. As sons, they wanted to believe their father had protected them. As men, they started to see cracks in that belief. Consider the pain of replaying childhood memories only to see them in a new light. A comforting word from Charles at Balmoral suddenly felt rehearsed. A decision to shield them from certain reports now looked like deliberate concealment. Every memory began to fracture under the suspicion that their father had always known more than he admitted. And what of Charles himself? He had ascended to the throne carrying decades of scandal and controversy. His love for Camilla, once ridiculed and despised, was finally legitimized. Yet the ghost of Diana never left him. Every public appearance, every speech, was haunted by her absence. He was a king, but he was also a man who had lived in the shadow of a woman the world adored more than him. For William and Harry, this duality became impossible to ignore. Was Charles simply a flawed father caught in a tragedy, or was he the keeper of secrets too dark to reveal? That is the question that drove them into confrontation. By the late 2010s, Harry had already begun distancing himself from the monarchy, voicing his pain more openly in interviews. William remained within the institution, but was quietly wrestling with his own doubts. Though their paths diverged, their mother's memory remained the one place where they stood side by side. When whispers began to surface about hidden files, sealed testimonies, and investigations that never saw daylight, both brothers were pulled back together. The need for answers outweighed their differences. They could no longer remain silent sons. They had to become truth seekers. Picture the moment they finally agreed to confront Charles. It wasn't in front of cameras or courtiers. It was private, raw, and charged with decades of suppressed emotion. Two grown men, no longer boys, facing the man who had shaped their lives, demanding to know what he had kept from them. The very question they asked pierced through the weight of protocol and bloodlines. Why did you end our mother's life? Whether it was literal, symbolic, or accusatory, the words carried the force of 30 years of anguish. It wasn't just about a father and sons. It was about history, legacy, and truth. The end of this introduction must leave the audience standing at the edge of this confrontation. For decades, the official narrative of Diana's death painted it as an accident, a tragedy of circumstance. But William and Harry's discovery shatters that neat picture. It forces us to reconsider not just the past, but the monarchy's very foundation. What does it mean when truth and survival collide? What happens when the heirs to the throne themselves no longer trust the king? This is not a story about the past. It is a story about the present, about wounds that never healed, and about a reckoning that has finally come. And so we arrive here, at the threshold of the main story. William and Harry, no longer boys, but men carrying scars, finally turn to their father with a demand for answers. What Charles reveals, or refuses to reveal, will not only reshape their lives, but could also unravel the monarchy itself. The truth has been buried for 30 years, but as every buried secret eventually does, it has clawed its way to the surface. The world remembers Diana's death in Paris as a global tragedy, but for William and Harry, it was the moment their lives were split in two. Before that night, they were just two young boys who happened to live within palace walls. After it, they became the motherless heirs of a monarchy already drowning in scandal. For them, the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel wasn't just a headline. It was a wound that never closed, one that left them wandering through childhood and adolescence with questions no one dared answer. William was only 15, on the cusp of adulthood, but still a child in every sense. Harry was 12, playful, mischievous, and completely unprepared for a world without his mother's warmth. When the news broke at Balmoral, the adults scrambled to control the narrative. Phones rang through the night, courtiers whispered, and the Queen moved quickly to steady the institution. But the boys weren't thinking about duty or monarchy. They were thinking about the woman who tucked them in at night, who laughed with them in the gardens, who promised them she would always be there. In a single moment, that promise was gone. Imagine the silence of that castle, the thick Scottish air heavy with grief that no one dared express. William has spoken years later about how he internalized the pain, about how he became almost robotic, determined not to show weakness in front of the cameras. Harry, in contrast, rebelled against the silence, exploding later in life with confessions about how angry he was that no one let him grieve properly. At Balmoral, they weren't offered explanations. They were offered platitudes. They weren't given space to mourn. They were pushed into history's most public stage, walking behind their mother's coffin as the world stared. That image, two boys trailing behind Diana's casket, became a defining symbol of loss. Millions wept as they watched, but behind those faces of quiet dignity were children who had barely slept, who still hadn't processed that they would never hear her voice again. William later admitted that he could barely put one foot in front of the other. Harry confessed that he walked in a daze, his head full of disbelief, his heart screaming. But at the time, both were told to hold their heads high, to embody the strength of the monarchy. The world praised their composure, yet very few paused to wonder at the cruelty of placing that burden on children. From that day on, William and Harry carried Diana's absence like an invisible weight. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone became a reminder of what was missing. When William graduated, he felt the sting of her empty chair. When Harry joined the army, he wondered what she would have said to him in private. These are not small wounds. They are the kind that reshape a person's soul. And yet, despite all of this, neither boy was allowed to openly question what really happened in Paris. As the years unfolded, they began piecing together fragments of their mother's last days. They heard stories of her being chased by paparazzi, of her warnings that she felt hunted, of her unease with the establishment that once embraced her. Diana had famously said she felt like a lamb to the slaughter. For two sons who adored her, those words rang louder and louder as they grew older. Was it really an accident? Or was it the result of something far darker, a design meant to silence her? These were questions whispered in the back of their minds, questions they dared not ask openly, yet they never went away. In their teenage years, grief took different shapes for the brothers. William buried himself in responsibility. He became protective of Harry, careful with his public image, and determined to honor his mother through duty. Harry, on the other hand, became reckless. He drank, he partied, he got into fights. His pain exploded in ways that William's remained hidden. Both responses, though different, pointed back to the same wound. They had lost their anchor, and the man left to guide them. Charles felt like a stranger carrying his own guilt. Charles did not speak to them about suspicions. He did not explain the inconsistencies, the unanswered questions, the eerie accuracy of Diana's warnings. He treated it as a closed chapter, a tragedy to be endured but never dissected. For William and Harry, this silence became suffocating. Their grief wasn't only about loss. It was about confusion, about the absence of truth. Imagine growing up with the entire world speculating about your mother's death while you, her son, were expected to remain quiet. That is the cage William and Harry lived in. In private, they clung to Diana's memory. Harry often described her as the one person who made him feel seen, who gave him love without condition. William remembered her laughter, her mischievous streak, her way of breaking royal rules to give her sons a taste of normal life. Diana took them to McDonald's, snuck them to amusement parks, hugged them in ways that palace protocol never allowed. Losing her meant losing not just a mother, but the only shield they had against the cold machinery of monarchy. As young adults, William and Harry began to notice how Diana's death continued to shape their choices. William grew cautious, measured, aware that every move would be scrutinized. Harry, meanwhile, spoke openly of how he couldn't escape the anger, how it followed him into relationships, friendships, even into his time in Afghanistan. The truth was never far from their minds, and neither was the suspicion that there was more to the story than they had been told. The tragedy of growing up without a mother is not just about the absence of her presence. It is about the absence of answers. Every time William and Harry heard her name, every time they saw her face on a magazine cover, they were reminded not only of what they had lost, but also of what had been denied them: closure. Closure requires truth, and truth requires transparency. Neither was offered to them. Instead, they were handed silence, and silence corrodes over time. Chapter 1 sets the stage for everything that follows because it captures the raw, emotional core of William and Harry's journey. They weren't princes chasing conspiracy theories. They were sons haunted by loss. Before suspicion, before confrontation, there was grief. Before anger, there was silence. And before truth, there was a lie of omission that left two boys wandering through the most public childhood in the world with the most private of pains. This is the foundation on which the rest of the story builds. Two boys without their mother, thrust into roles they didn't choose, and forced to live under a narrative that may not have been the whole truth. Their breakdown, 30 years later, doesn't begin with confrontation. It begins here, with that endless walk behind a coffin, with the silence of Balmoral, and with the unbearable reality that their mother was gone and no one was willing to tell them why. In the days following Diana's death, King Charles faced an impossible balancing act. He was a grieving ex-husband, a father to two devastated boys, and the future king of a monarchy already hanging by a thread. To the outside world, he appeared calm, composed, even dutiful. But inside the walls of Balmoral, the cracks in his relationship with William and Harry grew wider. What unfolded in those days and the years that followed created a distance between father and sons that was never fully bridged. It was a gap not only of communication but of trust, and that gap would later become the breeding ground for suspicion and confrontation. The first days after the crash were marked by confusion. William and Harry wanted answers, but Charles offered them protocol. He spoke of arrangements, of ceremonies, of the importance of presenting themselves with dignity to the public. He was quick to emphasize duty, but slow to comfort. William, being the older son, felt the weight of his father's expectations more sharply. He was already being molded into the image of the future king, told to hold his grief with restraint. Harry, too young to shoulder such demands, reacted with anger. He didn't want dignity. He wanted his mother back. Yet Charles, shaped by his own upbringing under a stoic queen and an emotionally distant Prince Philip, did not know how to reach his children in their rawest moment of need. Over time, this emotional distance hardened. Charles loved his sons, but his way of loving was transactional, bound in lessons of responsibility, image, and reputation. He believed he was preparing them for the lives they would inherit, but to William and Harry, it often felt like neglect. When they needed a father who could sit with them in their grief, they received a monarch in training's lecture. When they needed comfort, they were told to remember their place. That dissonance carved a quiet ache into their bond, one that would never fully heal. Consider the role Diana once played as the bridge between Charles and the boys. She was their translator, their shield, the warmth that softened Charles's coldness. Without her, William and Harry were left with a father they could not fully understand. Charles was attentive in certain ways. He ensured their education, arranged their schedules, introduced them to the rituals of royal life. But emotionally, he remained unreachable. For children who had just lost their mother, that unreachability was devastating. The public saw glimpses of this fracture in the years that followed. William, who often tried to present himself as composed, rarely spoke of his father in emotional terms. Harry, however, allowed his frustrations to surface more openly. He described growing up in an environment where emotions were stifled, where mental health struggles were ignored, and where the pressure to maintain appearances overrode every human instinct. Charles, for his part, seemed torn between his love for his sons and his role as the heir to the throne. But what the public didn't see was the unspoken resentment that began to grow in William and Harry. Resentment not only for the accident in Paris, but for the silence that followed. When Charles finally married Camilla years later, that resentment deepened. For William and Harry, the marriage was not just about their father finding happiness. It was a reminder of the betrayal their mother had endured. Diana had famously declared that there were 3 people in her marriage, and now, the third had officially taken her place. For the brothers, it felt like their mother's memory was being overwritten, her pain dismissed. And though they tried to support their father in public, behind closed doors, the marriage widened the emotional distance. Charles was moving on. William and Harry were still stuck in the wreckage of 1997. In this chapter, we must look at the subtle ways distance can fracture a family. Charles was never overtly cruel to his sons. He was not a tyrant or a neglectful parent in the obvious sense. But his emotional absence cut just as deeply. William and Harry both admitted later in life that they felt as though they grew up without proper guidance, forced to navigate grief on their own. The public admired their resilience, but resilience is often born from loneliness. As they grew older, the brothers started to see their father less as a parent and more as a figure of the institution. Every interaction felt tinged with formality. Conversations were brief, practical, often centered around appearances. Charles may have thought he was protecting them by keeping certain truths hidden, but to William and Harry, his silence came across as indifference. They couldn't understand why he never spoke to them about Diana's fears, about her desperate attempts to make her voice heard before her death. That silence became its own kind of confession, a shadow that loomed over every family gathering. Harry, in particular, carried the brunt of this distance. He admitted in later interviews that he felt like the spare, the one less important in his father's eyes. This perception only intensified his sense of alienation. William, though closer to Charles in terms of duty, was not spared either. His relationship with his father was complicated by the knowledge that one day he would inherit the throne. It was less about father and son, and more about king and heir. That dynamic robbed them of the chance to grieve together as family. It is within this context that suspicion began to take root. Charles's refusal to openly discuss Diana's death created an information vacuum. Into that vacuum rushed speculation, rumor, and doubt. William and Harry were not naive. They read the newspapers, they heard the whispers, they knew the conspiracy theories. And though they tried to push those thoughts aside, the fact that their father never addressed them directly only fueled their curiosity. Why didn't he ever sit them down and explain? Why did he avoid every hard question? That avoidance became louder than any answer could have been. The distance between Charles and his sons was not just emotional, it was physical too. In the years after Diana's death, Charles traveled frequently, often leaving William and Harry in the care of nannies, staff, or boarding school. For two boys desperate for stability, this absence reinforced the sense that their father was prioritizing duty and personal life over their needs. They may not have been able to articulate it at the time, but deep down, it planted a painful thought. Perhaps they were not his first priority. By the time they reached adulthood, William and Harry had become masters at masking this distance in public. They smiled alongside their father, stood with him at ceremonies, and gave the impression of unity. But behind the photographs lay years of unspoken tension. The warmth of a father-son relationship had been replaced by cold obligation. And when whispers of hidden truths about Diana's death grew louder, William and Harry were left wondering whether that distance had been intentional all along. Was it not just emotional unavailability, but a deliberate strategy to keep them from uncovering too much? This chapter ends with the growing realization that William and Harry were not just sons navigating grief. They were heirs navigating secrets. Their father, the one person who should have guided them through the tragedy, had instead erected walls of silence. That silence became unbearable, especially as they matured and began to demand more from him. The distance that had defined their relationship was no longer just a matter of personality. It was the foundation of a much darker suspicion. And so, the stage is set for what comes next. Two sons, distanced from their father by grief, duty, and silence, begin to confront the idea that their father may have hidden more than his emotions. That the distance was not just emotional, but protective of secrets too devastating to share. This growing unease becomes the fuel for the confrontation that would one day explode. Every great tragedy leaves behind paperwork, but in the case of Princess Diana's death, the paperwork didn't just gather dust in filing cabinets. It was locked away, sealed, protected from public eyes as if the truth itself was too dangerous to face. For years, William and Harry knew fragments of the story. They heard about the investigations, the inquests, the French authorities, the endless speculation about drivers, seatbelts, paparazzi, and tunnels. But they also knew something else. Not every file had been opened. Not every word had been read. And some of the most important evidence was tucked away under lock and key. The notion of sealed files became a shadow that followed them as they grew older. At first, as teenagers, they accepted what they were told, that the secrecy was necessary, that it was about protecting them, that certain details were too horrific for children to read. But as the years passed, as they entered adulthood, that explanation grew thinner. They were no longer boys in need of shielding. They were men, heirs, and still, their father refused to let them look behind the curtain. This secrecy was no longer about protection, it was about control. What exactly was hidden in those files? That question is central to this chapter. Among the documents were rumored to be witness statements, police reports, autopsy results, and transcripts of Diana's recorded words, some of which had never been released publicly. There were photographs, accounts of phone calls, and perhaps most disturbing, references to threats she claimed to have received in the months before her death. The official explanation painted a picture of an accident caused by reckless driving and paparazzi harassment. But the sealed files suggested something more complex, something with layers of political, royal, and even international entanglement. For William and Harry, learning of these sealed records was like discovering a locked door inside their own home. Every time they asked about it, the answer was the same. It's not for you to see, not yet, maybe never. That answer, rather than reassuring them, only fed their suspicion. Why would a father hide the full truth from his sons, especially when it concerned their mother? If the files only confirmed what the public already knew, why keep them secret? The secrecy itself became evidence that there was something to hide. As they grew into adulthood, the brothers began quietly pursuing information on their own. William, careful and methodical, reached out through official channels, inquiring about records and timelines. Harry, more impulsive, spoke openly with people who had once worked close to his mother, bodyguards, staff, journalists. Both paths led to the same conclusion. There was more to the story than they had been told. And the files their father refused to open to them might hold the key. What must it feel like to realize that the truth about your mother's death might be sitting in a folder, waiting, while you were denied access? That image haunted William and Harry. It became a metaphor for their entire childhood. Just as their emotions were sealed off, so too was the truth. Every unanswered question, every rumor they heard from the press, seemed to circle back to that locked drawer. The idea of sealed files is not new to royal history. The monarchy has long had a practice of hiding documents, correspondence, diaries, evidence, under the guise of national security or personal privacy. But for William and Harry, this wasn't history. It was their life, their mother, their wound. And when they learned that the 30-year mark might finally open some of those files, the countdown began. They would no longer be denied. But would the answers heal them or break them? Charles's role in this secrecy is critical. As both their father and the man preparing to inherit the throne, he had every reason to keep certain details hidden. The monarchy thrives on control of narrative. One scandal can bring down decades of tradition. And Diana's death was not just any scandal. It was the one that almost destroyed the crown. For Charles, sealing the files may have seemed like an act of survival, not just for himself, but for the institution he would one day lead. But for William and Harry, survival of the monarchy meant the sacrifice of their truth. And that sacrifice cut deeply. Imagine the conversations they might have had behind palace doors. William, trying to reason with his father, reminding him that as sons, they deserved transparency. Harry, furious, accusing Charles of valuing the crown over his own children. Charles, evasive, repeating the same rehearsed line. It was an accident, nothing more. But both brothers could see in his face, in his avoidance, that there was more he wasn't saying. That avoidance became more damning than any words could have been. The sealed files also carried symbolic weight. They represented the wall between generations, the clash between truth and tradition. Diana had always pushed for openness, for tearing down the walls of royal secrecy. Charles, on the other hand, had been raised in a system that thrived on silence. In many ways, the files became the battlefield for this clash of values. By keeping them hidden, Charles preserved the monarchy's old way of survival. By demanding access, William and Harry embraced their mother's legacy of truth-telling. As time passed, the pressure grew. The media, too, whispered about the sealed evidence, about what might be inside. The brothers could not escape it. Every anniversary of Diana's death brought new headlines, new speculation, new claims from insiders. And every time, William and Harry were reminded that their father had the power to show them the truth, yet chose not to. That choice felt like betrayal layered on top of grief. By their 30s, both men were ready to confront what had been denied them. William, preparing for his future role as king, knew he could not step into leadership while still chained to unanswered questions about his mother. Harry, already distancing himself from the royal machine, saw the sealed files as proof that the monarchy would never change. For both, the files symbolized unfinished business, a ghost that haunted every decision they made. This chapter must end with the growing inevitability of confrontation. The sealed files were more than paper. They were the physical manifestation of 30 years of silence. And when William and Harry realized that their father was the gatekeeper of those secrets, the confrontation became unavoidable. They were no longer willing to live under the shadow of half-truths. They needed answers, even if those answers shattered their relationship with their father. The truth was out there, hidden in black ink and official seals, waiting to be unleashed. And for William and Harry, the question was no longer whether they could handle the truth. It was whether their father could survive it. The British monarchy has always thrived on whispers. Behind closed doors of gilded rooms, courtiers, staff, and advisors have carried secrets for centuries, secrets that rarely see the light of day. Princess Diana's life and death generated whispers louder than most, but those whispers did not vanish after her passing. They lingered in the halls of Buckingham Palace, at Sandringham, and at Balmoral, forming a murky undercurrent beneath the official story. For William and Harry, growing up in this environment was like living inside a house of echoes. They heard fragments, hints, half-truths, but never the full story. And it was within these whispers that their suspicions of their father deepened. From their earliest years after Diana's death, the brothers noticed how often conversations about their mother stopped when they entered the room. Staff exchanged quick glances, conversations went quiet, files were closed. At first, as children, they assumed it was simply adults being protective. But as they matured, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It was not protection, it was avoidance. People were hiding things, and the silence was not just for their benefit, but for the survival of the monarchy. These whispers came in many forms. A butler who once served Diana quietly confided to a friend that she had been terrified of her fate. A bodyguard hinted that not every detail of Paris had been revealed. A member of staff remembered Diana saying she feared a conspiracy to end her life in a car crash. The brothers grew up hearing fragments like these, always in whispers, never in official channels. And every whisper pointed back to the same chilling thought. Perhaps the accident wasn't entirely an accident. The palace itself became a maze of secrecy. William and Harry learned early that asking questions rarely led to answers. If they pressed too hard, they were told to stop digging. If they hinted at suspicions, they were warned not to damage the institution. Even family friends, people they thought they could trust, spoke in veiled language. This constant evasion fed their unease. Why did everyone seem so afraid to talk about the one person who had defined their lives? Why was Diana a ghost in conversations, present but untouchable? The whispers were not only internal. The media carried its own undercurrent of speculation. Journalists spoke of informants who claimed to have seen suspicious movements in Paris. Others mentioned documents that contradicted official timelines. These stories, often dismissed as conspiracy theories, echoed too closely with what William and Harry were hearing in hushed tones within palace walls. The collision of public rumor and private whispers created an atmosphere thick with suspicion. For the brothers, it became harder and harder to ignore. At the center of these whispers was their father. Charles was never openly accused within the palace, but the avoidance around his role spoke louder than words. Staff members seemed careful about what they said in front of him. Conversations about Diana's last days often ended abruptly when his name came up. To William and Harry, this felt deliberate. It was as if people were shielding him, or shielding them from him. And the more they noticed it, the more convinced they became that their father held answers no one else dared to speak aloud. The whispers also carried a painful emotional weight. Diana had been the one to comfort them, to break through the rigid walls of royal life with warmth and honesty. She had been the one to tell them the truth about the pressures of the monarchy, even when it was uncomfortable. Her death left them with a father who embodied the opposite: formality, secrecy, silence. And so, every whisper about Diana became a reminder not just of what they had lost, but of how different life had become without her. One particularly haunting detail that reached the brothers was Diana's prediction of her own death. She had told close friends, and even written it down, that she believed she would die in a staged accident. When William and Harry heard this for themselves as young men, it shook them to the core. It was no longer speculation, it was their mother's own words. And when they realized that many in the palace had known about this note, yet never spoken of it openly, the betrayal deepened. Why had no one warned them? Why had no one investigated it more thoroughly? The culture of whispers did more than keep secrets, it eroded trust. For William and Harry, trust in the palace hierarchy was already fragile. Growing up, they often felt like pawns in a game larger than themselves, moved around for appearances rather than cared for as sons. The endless whispers confirmed their suspicion. They were being managed, not protected. Every nod, every half-sentence, every awkward silence reinforced the idea that truth was a commodity they would never be allowed to access. This lack of transparency had a direct impact on their relationship with Charles. Whenever they tried to ask him directly, he dodged. He changed the subject, grew cold, or simply refused to answer. To William and Harry, this avoidance was damning. If their father truly had nothing to hide, why was he so unwilling to face their questions? The whispers within the palace told one story, and Charles's silence told another. Together, they created a truth too loud to ignore. As the years went on, the whispers only grew. New staff members brought new fragments. Retired aides felt freer to speak off the record. Former bodyguards gave interviews, hinting that Diana's fears had been justified. Each fragment became another thread in a web that William and Harry were desperate to untangle. But at the center of that web was their father, and the realization that confronting him was the only way to silence the whispers once and for all. The palace is often described as an institution built on tradition, but for William and Harry, it felt more like a vault. Secrets were currency, and silence was law. They grew up surrounded by privilege and wealth, but at the cost of clarity and truth. And as they matured, they realized that no amount of protocol or ceremony could mask the gnawing feeling that the whispers were trying to tell them something their father would not. This chapter ends with the brothers reaching a breaking point. The whispers were no longer background noise. They had become deafening. Every new detail that surfaced, every guarded glance between staff members, every unexplained silence pointed them back to the same conclusion. Their father was hiding something. And when the whispers grew too loud to ignore, William and Harry knew that silence was no longer an option. Confrontation was inevitable. At the heart of this story is not only a father hiding secrets, but two brothers navigating grief, suspicion, and a bond forged in silence. William and Harry were shaped by the same tragedy, yet they carried it in different ways. Their bond was unspoken because words often failed them. How could two boys, both broken in different directions, ever fully articulate the depth of their pain? And yet, despite their differences, their shared love for their mother and the haunting questions about her death kept them tethered together. From their earliest days after Diana's passing, William and Harry leaned on each other in ways the world could not see. The public image painted them as stoic young princes, walking dutifully behind their mother's coffin, shoulders squared under the weight of expectation. But behind closed doors, they were just two boys clinging to each other for survival. William, the elder, often felt the responsibility to protect Harry. He was cautious, serious, and more measured, shouldering his role as the future king even in his teens. Harry, by contrast, was fiery and impulsive, letting his grief erupt in ways William never allowed himself to. This difference often made them clash, but beneath those clashes was an understanding. No one else could possibly understand what they had endured. That unspoken bond revealed itself in small ways. A glance during public events, a half-smile when memories of their mother surfaced, or even the way they defended each other in moments of criticism. They didn't need to say the words. They carried the same scar, and that scar was a language of its own. When whispers about Diana's death grew louder, William and Harry didn't have to explain to one another how deeply it affected them. They already knew. Each was haunted by the same unanswerable question, and though their personalities led them down different paths, the destination was always the same. They wanted the truth. William's way of honoring his mother was through discipline and restraint. He buried himself in duty, believing that embodying her compassion while maintaining royal composure was the best way to keep her spirit alive. For him, Diana's memory was a guiding star, a moral compass he followed carefully. Harry, however, struggled to contain his emotions. He lashed out, turned to drinking and reckless behavior, and admitted later that he felt adrift without her. His way of honoring her was through defiance, by refusing to let the institution that hurt her define his life. These differences often created distance between them, but the bond never fully broke. When whispers began to connect their father to Diana's death, or at least to secrets about it, this bond was tested. William initially tried to remain cautious. His future depended on the stability of the monarchy, and directly confronting Charles felt like a dangerous move. But Harry, already skeptical of the royal machine, pushed harder. He wanted answers, and he was less afraid of the consequences. Despite this tension, there came moments where their unspoken bond pulled them back together. William knew Harry's rage was born from the same grief he felt. Harry knew William's restraint was a shield, not indifference. What makes their bond so striking is the duality of it. On the surface, the brothers often seem divided. Different approaches to the press, different views on their roles, different attitudes toward the palace. Yet beneath that division was the shared memory of Diana. She was the one who played football with them in the garden, who bent royal rules to sneak them into fast food restaurants, who hugged them tightly in a world where hugs were rare. Losing her created a chasm, but it also created an unshakable bond. They might argue, they might take different paths, but when it came to their mother, they were united. The unspoken bond grew even stronger as the sealed files and palace whispers came into play. Both William and Harry realized that the narrative they had been given did not match the fragments they were uncovering. For years, they had ignored the nagging inconsistencies, afraid of what digging deeper might reveal. But as men, they could no longer silence those instincts. Their shared suspicion drew them closer, even as their personalities made them approach the confrontation differently. William wanted a careful, deliberate plan. Harry wanted a direct, emotional confrontation. The tension between these approaches created friction, but also revealed the depth of their shared determination. This chapter is not only about grief, but about how grief binds. William and Harry's bond was not about constant agreement. It was about shared pain. Even when oceans separated them, even when the press painted them as rivals, their bond remained in the quiet moments. In private, they shared stories of Diana, laughed about her sense of humor, and admitted their fears about what had really happened. Those conversations were rare, but they carried more weight than any public speech ever could. They didn't need to say everything. They only needed to know they were not alone. What must it feel like to share such a bond? To know that the only person who understands your grief is also the one carrying it in his own way? For William and Harry, this bond was both salvation and torment. It gave them strength to confront their father, but it also forced them to confront the possibility that the answers might destroy not only their trust in Charles, but their faith in the institution they were born into. The brothers' unspoken bond also served as a stark contrast to their relationship with Charles. With him, there was silence, distance, and avoidance. With each other, there was an honesty that required no words. They could sense each other's pain without explanation, and that intimacy only deepened the suspicion that the one person missing from their bond, their father, was the very person keeping the truth from them. As the years unfolded and the confrontation with Charles drew closer, this bond became their greatest weapon. They could not be divided on this issue, not fully. They might disagree on approach, but they were united in purpose. Both wanted to know the truth about their mother. Both wanted to confront the man who had withheld it. Both wanted to honor Diana, not just with words or duty, but with justice. This chapter closes with an image that defines their bond. Two brothers, sitting together late at night, reflecting on their childhood, speaking softly of their mother. One says aloud what both have always thought. She deserved better. And we deserve to know. No further words are needed. The bond speaks for itself. Every family that carries a secret has a moment where silence can no longer hold it. For William and Harry, that moment arrived not in the aftermath of Diana's death, not in their teenage years, but decades later when the weight of silence, suspicion, and whispers finally grew too heavy to bear. The breaking point was not a single event, but a series of moments. small cracks in the wall of secrecy that widened over time until the truth demanded to be confronted. As William and Harry entered adulthood, the questions about Diana's death followed them everywhere. Every interview they gave, every milestone they reached, the press circled back to 1997. At first, they brushed it off with carefully rehearsed lines about privacy, healing, and the passage of time. But those responses were thin shields against the storm of doubt that lived inside them. Each brother coped differently. William, with his sense of duty, tried to bury himself in the role of heir. Harry, increasingly vocal about his struggles, turned his pain outward, challenging the institution in ways that unsettled the palace. The breaking point began to take shape as Harry started speaking more candidly in public. He admitted to years of anger, to feeling abandoned, to suffering from panic attacks when he saw cameras flashing. He revealed that he had sought therapy, that he had been haunted by the memory of walking behind his mother's coffin. These admissions, once considered taboo in royal circles, struck a chord with the public but created friction within the family. Charles, who had built his entire life on silence and restraint, viewed Harry's openness as dangerous. William, though more careful with his words, began to realize that Harry was simply saying aloud what he had always felt in private. The difference was not in pain, but in expression. The true breaking point, however, came when fragments of long-buried evidence began to surface. Reports of inconsistencies in the official account of Diana's death resurfaced in the press. Former staff members began granting interviews, hinting that Diana's fears of being silenced had been dismissed too quickly. A former bodyguard recalled her saying she felt she was being watched. A journalist revealed the existence of letters in which Diana warned she would die in a staged car accident. These details had always circulated in whispers, but now they were gaining traction again, and William and Harry could not ignore them. One particular revelation shook them more than the rest. Mention of files they had never been allowed to see. Files their father had access to. Files that might contain testimony, photographs, or reports that could finally confirm or deny their suspicions. The knowledge that Charles had kept these files from them for decades ignited a fury neither brother could suppress. What had once been quiet doubt hardened into determination. They could no longer sit silently while their father guarded the truth. The brothers found themselves drawn back together in this shared fury. Despite the differences that had emerged between them, Harry's estrangement from the royal family, William's commitment to the crown, they agreed on one thing. They had a right to know what their father had hidden. For years, they had danced around the question, each waiting for the right moment to confront him. But as the whispers grew louder, the urgency intensified. The breaking point had been reached. This chapter is not just about external revelations, but about internal ones. For William, the breaking point was realizing that he could not step into the role of king while still chained to unanswered questions about his mother. He knew the public would never let Diana's memory rest, and he also knew that he himself could not live with uncertainty. For Harry, the breaking point was more personal. He had reached a stage in his life where he could no longer tolerate silence. His departure from the monarchy had already exposed his frustration with the system. Confronting his father was no longer a choice. It was inevitable. The confrontation loomed over them like a storm cloud. In private conversations, William and Harry rehearsed what they would say. They debated whether to approach Charles together or separately. William feared the fallout such a confrontation might cause within the monarchy. Harry argued that the monarchy's survival was irrelevant if it came at the cost of their mother's truth. These debates were tense, but they revealed something critical. Despite their differences, both brothers knew they could not turn back. The breaking point also carried an emotional toll. Memories of Diana flooded back more vividly than ever. Her laughter, her warmth, her ability to make them feel human in a world of protocol. All of it contrasted sharply with the cold silence that followed her death. For William and Harry, this contrast became unbearable. How could they continue to honor their mother's legacy while accepting a silence that betrayed it? The chapter also highlights the pressure of the outside world. The media's renewed interest in Diana's death stirred public debate. Documentaries, articles, and interviews reignited speculation. The public's questions mirrored the brothers' own. Why had Diana feared for her life? Why were certain files sealed? Why had the palace remained so tight-lipped? Every headline, every whispered rumor added fuel to the fire, pushing William and Harry closer to the moment they had long avoided. And then came the realization that time itself was running out. With the 30-year mark approaching, the possibility of sealed files being opened grew nearer. William and Harry knew they had to act before the truth slipped further out of their control. The weight of 3 decades of silence bore down on them, and the cost of inaction became too high. This chapter closes with the image of 2 brothers, united by grief and driven by anger, preparing to confront the man who had shaped their lives yet withheld their truth. The breaking point was not just about Diana's death. It was about the years of silence that followed, the unanswered questions, and the realization that their father might have chosen monarchy over family. The confrontation was inevitable, and as they prepared for it, William and Harry understood that their lives, and perhaps the monarchy itself, would never be the same again. There are moments in life that cannot be rehearsed, moments where the weight of decades condenses into a single breath, a single question, a single demand for truth. For William and Harry, that moment arrived when they finally decided to confront their father. It did not happen in front of cameras or during public ceremonies. It happened in private, away from the watchful eyes of courtiers and advisors, away from the carefully crafted image of the monarchy. It was not a meeting between princes and a king. It was a meeting between sons and a father, and it carried 30 years of grief, suspicion, and unspoken pain. The lead-up to that confrontation was heavy with tension. William had always been careful, calculating in his approach. He knew the risks of speaking too directly, of accusing a monarch who now bore the crown. But Harry, emboldened by his distance from the royal institution, pressed for a direct approach. He was tired of silence, tired of evasions, tired of feeling like his father had chosen the monarchy over him. In the end, they agreed that this moment could not be delayed any longer. They would face Charles together. The setting itself was deliberate. They chose a private room within Clarence House, a place filled with memories but also burdened with shadows. The walls had seen countless royal meetings, but none like this. The atmosphere was thick, not with ceremony, but with emotion. No cameras, no aides, just father and sons. For the first time in decades, there was no crown, no duty, just family. And yet, the weight of the monarchy was present in every silence, every look, every word left unsaid. When the conversation began, it did not start with accusations. William opened cautiously, speaking of their mother, of how much her absence had shaped their lives. He spoke of milestones she missed, of the way her memory still guided them, and of the pain that had never faded. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the storm beneath. Harry, by contrast, cut straight to the point. His voice was sharper, his words direct. "We know you've kept things from us. We know you've hidden the truth about Mom." Charles, seated opposite them, did not react immediately. He shifted slightly, his hands folded, his face carefully composed. For a man who had lived his entire life under scrutiny, controlling his expression had become second nature. But his silence, his hesitation, only deepened the wound. William leaned forward, his voice lower but heavier. "Why did you keep the files from us? Why didn't you ever tell us what really happened?" The confrontation was not about a single moment of deception. It was about years of silence, years of whispers, years of unanswered questions. For William and Harry, this was the moment where they laid bare their pain. They spoke of the whispers they had heard within the palace, the staff who had hinted at things unsaid, the rumors of their mother's fears, and the files locked away from their eyes. Each word was a blade, cutting through the carefully maintained walls of secrecy Charles had built. Harry's anger boiled over as he spoke of Diana's note predicting her own death. She knew. She told people she would die in a car accident, and you knew she said that. You knew, and you never told us. His voice cracked, not just with anger, but with grief. William, though more restrained, echoed the same sentiment. "We've lived our lives in the shadow of her death, and all we've ever wanted was honesty. From you, our father." Charles finally spoke, his voice measured but strained. He denied direct involvement, insisted that the tragedy was an accident, the result of reckless circumstances. He said he had withheld details to protect them, to shield them from horrors they were too young to understand. But the brothers were no longer children, and protection sounded too much like deception. Protect us, Harry snapped. You didn't protect us. You lied to us. You kept us in the dark while the whole world speculated about our mother. Do you have any idea what that did to us? The confrontation spiraled into layers of pain. William demanded to know why the files were sealed, why witnesses had not been fully cross-examined, why rumors of Diana's fears were brushed aside. Harry accused Charles of choosing the monarchy over his own sons, of prioritizing survival of the crown over the truth about their mother. Charles, cornered, tried to defend himself, insisting that his decisions were made under impossible pressure. But every defense sounded hollow against 30 years of silence. At one point, the room fell into heavy silence, the kind that stretches so long it becomes unbearable. William finally broke it, his voice quieter, trembling. We've carried this all our lives. We've carried the weight of losing her, of the world watching us grieve, of never knowing the truth. And all this time, you could have told us more. But you didn't. You chose silence. His words were not shouted, but they cut deeper than Harry's fury. They carried the disappointment of a son who had tried to trust but could no longer ignore the cracks. Charles's face betrayed a flicker of something, guilt, fear, maybe both. For all his composure, he was still a man facing the raw anger of his sons. He may have expected the confrontation, but the intensity of their pain was something he could not fully control. He tried again to argue that his silence had been necessary, that as the heir to the throne he had been burdened with responsibilities beyond their understanding. But to William and Harry, this was no longer about the throne. This was about family. The confrontation stretched on for hours. Tears surfaced, voices rose, silences dragged. At times, William tried to mediate, to keep the discussion from exploding. At others, Harry pushed harder, unwilling to let Charles retreat behind vague explanations. They wanted clarity, and they would not leave without it. Whether Charles gave them the answers they sought or not, the confrontation itself marked a turning point. For the first time, the silence was broken. The unspoken pain had been voiced. The accusations had been made. The chapter closes with an image of 3 men in a room, the air heavy with decades of grief. A father, burdened by secrets. 2 sons, burdened by loss. No cameras, no courtiers, no ceremony. Only raw truth, finally spoken aloud. The confrontation may not have given them closure, but it stripped away the illusion that silence could protect them any longer. From this moment on, the truth could no longer be ignored, and the fracture within the family could no longer be hidden.